Hi, everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand registered not-for-profit charitable educational trust called Common Knowledge, and we hold all of the birthing better skills that hundreds of mothers and fathers developed in the early 1970s, and I was part of that development. But we also developed a concept. So a concept is an idea, and the idea you put words to. Then you put actions to those ideas. And sometimes you put systems to them, and sometimes they even become policies. But the idea back in the early 1970s with the hundreds of families that I worked with who developed the birthing better skills was a simple concept. 100% of pregnant women will give birth one way or another. Every woman does the activity of giving birth with her baby, no matter where she births, no matter who's present at her birth, no matter her circumstances or her beliefs, or the choices she has, or the lack of choices, or the change of choices, or even what happens to or around her at the birth. Each of us is a woman who has been pregnant and given birth. We are doing that activity with our baby. And so therefore, within the concept of common knowledge trusts and birthing better families, we consider it to be normal and natural in pregnancy to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills so that we can work through that activity of birthing our baby. It's a simple concept. It has simple words attached to it, and there are simple actions, which is during your pregnancy, self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, and then use those skills as you do the activity of birthing your baby. This was in contrast to the rise of the natural birth movement. The natural birth movement vaguely formed around the 60s and the 70s. Three obstetricians, Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dick Reed, were those obstetricians who could see that all births were becoming more medicalized in modern culture. And they wanted to have, it's not whether they wanted to put a stop to it, that's not the word, it's they wanted to differentiate between women. And that was a normal thought. So they were saying that low-risk women could easily birth without medical care, could easily have a pain-free labor, and could have what they then defined as a natural birth. And that's where it all began to be confusing. And it became confusing because the idea was that low-risk women would have a low-risk birth, which is not always true. But the idea was also that high-risk women could not have an easy birth or an uncomplicated birth, and that's also not accurate. And the other confusion that existed was assuming that natural meant easy, good outcome and manageable, rather than risks being natural, problems being natural. Women suffering, not having skills was very normal. So we need to understand that way back at the beginning part of the natural birth movement, the ideas that were formed were confusing. Birth is natural. It comes naturally after pregnancy. It is natural that every woman has to do the activity of birthing her baby. That's normal. Nowadays, it is normal after pregnancy for some women who either are choosing to or accepting having a non-laboring cesarean. It's still an activity that we are doing with our baby. And it's still an activity that we can use skills for because we got pregnant. It's normal and natural that we get pregnant to have a baby, not a type of birth. So yesterday in our number 4 in this series, I talked about the larger understanding of it. And today I want to talk about us as women to each other, because right off at the start in the 60s and 70s, the message of the natural birth movement was confusing. Had Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed said this was their idea, 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, Any woman who's conscious should use skills to do the activity of birthing her baby. If we had started off with that, we would not be where we are now, because my generation of women who did use skills to birth our baby, because Lamaze was taught everywhere, so high-risk women, low-risk women, everybody used skills because the cesarean rate was 4.5%. Risks were considered to be normal. We labored and had vaginal births, whether we suffered, whether we labored for days or hours, whether we had a good birth, whether we had a horrible birth, whether we had a good outcome or a poor outcome. So back then, in 1970, which my lifetime, birth was considered to be normal and natural, and the differentiation between high and low risk was just beginning to form. And it was beginning to form because modern medicine was becoming more sophisticated than it had been ever before. So when the natural birth movement started, it was confusing. So I and the hundreds of families I worked with started a different concept, that everyone, it should just be normal and natural to learn some skills, and that the goal shouldn't be a type of birth. It should be that we cope well, that we manage well, that we work through, deal with, handle, stay on top of, and feel in control. And if we can do those things, then the likelihood is that we will feel fairly good about our birth. And my generation succeeded in that, because it's important to understand when we as women do the activity of birthing our baby and we don't cope and we don't manage well and we don't work through it and we don't deal with it and don't handle it and don't stay on top and don't feel in control, that's what leaves us feeling traumatized at birth. We can project that and say it's because what they or they didn't do to or for us, but that's a projection. Because when we use skills to birth our baby, when that's the actions we take, then we are infinitely more tolerant of what happens to or around us. Don't always like it. That's not the point. Being tolerant doesn't mean we agree with it or we like it. It means that we cope and manage while those things happen. So it was only in the late 1970s and the early 1980s that the natural birth movement really flourished. And it changed from being a local conversation and changed from being a national conversation, to being a global conversation. And the natural birth movement of the 80s was very well organized. Women were very well organized, and home birth midwives are very organized. I'm not going to talk about midwifery today. That will come in another conversation. And there'll be also another conversation about the New Zealand midwifery model, because from the 70s until the New Zealand midwifery model was put in place, it's a policy, so a system was put in place based on the idea, based on the words and the actions of the natural birth movement. That got put in place in 1990, plus much more. And it has succeeded in many ways because women love continuity of care. And it has been absolutely a shocking, sad commentary on, or a reveal of how important it is to understand the ideas and the words used and the actions used and the systems put in place that lead to policies. Because the ideas are really there to create goals or results. That's what we're going to talk about today. So, and it's primarily us as women. It's not the medical profession that is leading the childbirth message. It's women who have led the childbirth message. And now women aren't leading it. And now it's up to birth professionals to make the change to this new concept that when you're pregnant, you are going to do the activity of giving birth, and you need to self-learn skills and then use your skills. So we have to ask ourselves, in this chaotic childbirth message that's still going around in the 50 years that I've been involved, is what is our goal as women? And I mean women. I mean pregnant women, birthing women, women. not women who are never going to have babies. You just leave them out. Okay, just us who have gotten pregnant, had births. What is our goal? What's been that goal from my generation to your generation? What's that goal? And if we can't explain the goal, we have a problem, and we have a problem. So basically, on an individual basis, the goal is really simple. Each of us wants to have a safe birth, and we want to have a healthy baby, and we want to be healthy for ourselves. That's what we all want. You know, that's why it's what we want. And we've always wanted that throughout time and throughout place. Every woman wants that. Right? We want a safe birth, and we want to be healthy, and we want our baby to be healthy. We also want a positive birth experience. That more shows up around modern women than it does of women living in traditional communities, because there's a truth that underlies every single birth. There's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. And women who live in cultures where there is no medical care are infinitely more stoic because they accept that life can be rough. It can be wonderful, it can be beautiful, it can be tragic, it can be difficult, it's hard work. When you have to go get water and you have to build your own house and make your own clothes and grow your own food and take care of your own health, life is hard and it's full of skills. But in modern cultures, most of us lack a lot of skills, and so we go to professionals. And so we're expecting professionals to give us that positive birth experience. And if we have bought into the natural birth movement conversation, then since the 80s, we believe that we should just be able to choose the birth we want and to write a birth plan, and that birth professionals should try to give us that birth that they want. And if we don't get what we want, then we should be involved in decision making, which is very complicated. How many of us know? All of us who have had what we consider to be unnecessary cesareans, we can't go back and replay it. What if something had happened and the cesarean hadn't been done? Like in my generation, where there was only a 4.5% cesarean rate. So if we had twins or breeches or partial placenta previa or diabetes or Rh negative or a gazillion other things that we could have or not have, we still labored and we still had a vaginal birth, whether we had poor outcome or not. And my generation accepted poor outcomes. We didn't like them, but we knew that birth, pregnancy and birth and the newborn period was very challenging, particularly before immunizations and antibiotics. If you go to any cemetery around the world that has headstones, you'll see 20 to 30% of every cultural's children to the age of 5 dying. 20 to 30% of children under the age of 5 died before immunizations came along and antibiotics. So the modern medical profession saved us from a lot of risks. So individually, our goal as women is simple. We just want to have a safe birth, and we'd like to have a positive one. But our goal as women with a capital W is infinitely more complicated because collectively this is harder. We really do not care about anybody else's birth. It's as simple as that. I mean, even our best friends, maybe our sisters or our sister-in-laws, but we don't really care. And very few of us, when we meet some woman, another woman, and meet her, say, oh, what kind of birth did you have? Or what do you eat? Or how do you discipline your kids? Or, we don't talk about those things. But the natural birth movement has talked about it. And it is basically primacy in the conversation through books and through YouTube and through social media. So on a collective basis, what is our goal? Individually, it's simple. We just want to have a safe birth and a healthy birth, and we'd like to have positive experience, and we don't really give a flying F about anybody else. And we shouldn't say that we do. And we have to be honest about it, but we're giving each other messages all the time. So when I had a wonderful home birth, I then, of course, my best friend who had a hospital birth, it was very hard for me to know how to talk about that. It's very hard for her to talk about it because we've separated birth from this natural birth to other. And what's other? And the implication as women to each other is that my birth was a good birth and your birth was not really a true birth. And that's not okay as women. And we even do that to our children. I've listened to tens and thousands of birth stories, and tens and thousands of women talk about their children's births. And it begins to sound like this, right? He was my cesarean. She was my home birth. This is not okay. And I keep saying that's not okay. So if we had an idea that 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, and we had the words to explain that 100% of women are going to give birth, and it's activity each of us does with our baby, and it's normal and natural to learn birth and birth coaching skills, then use them to work through the activity of birthing our baby, our conversations to each other and about our children would be better. Right? We might be saying, I didn't really learn some skills in that birth. And so when birth unfolded, I really didn't have skills to go back to and use. But the next time I gave birth, I made certain I had better skills. Or we'd talk to each other about it. What breathing skills did you use? And how did they work? How did they adjust? How did they adapt? Were they sustainable, given that you had the choices you wanted, or you lacked choices, or your choices changed? We'd be having a different conversation. But we're not having a different conversation because the ideas of the natural birth movement was first initially with Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dick Reed, that if you were low risk and used their skills, you could achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical care. And that idea, those words, and those actions were faulty from the start. Had they said 100% of pregnant women are going to do the activity of birthing their baby, everyone needs to be skilled, then we would have all used skills, and we would have told our children, and our children would have told their children to use skills, and we would all be talking differently now. We can in the future, but it requires all of us to change. We have to change our ideas, we have to change the words, we have to change the actions, maybe change the systems and policies. That's a hard one. And we need to change how we talk to each other. So when the voice of the natural birth movement grew up in the 1970s, it grew into a global international discussion, and it took over. And I know, I've lived through this. So what has been the natural birth movement? Okay, besides that, there's this sort of ideal birth, but it was really the doctors were blamed. It was the medical profession that stopped women from having a natural birth. And that's still the approach. It's a very anti-medical approach. Skills, the Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dick Reed was basically an anti-medical approach, but it had some reason behind it. Why are they doing so many assessments, monitoring procedures? And the response to every evidence-based trend, there was one in the 70s, there was one in the 80s, there's one now, they change, was that if we assess and monitor, then we need to do procedures. It's because we know there's a risk and we're trying to reduce or prevent the risk from becoming a problem. Who is that led by? Is that led by the medical profession? No, it's led by us as consumers, because we in modern cultures are very risk averse. So we know in my generation that drunk drivers were killing people. So we demanded change. We knew that if we didn't have seatbelts or child restraints, we were more likely to be injured or died, or our children were. So we demanded change, and industry changed. When there was a low cesarean rate, and cesareans were complex surgery, then we started to wear bikinis, and we didn't want to be left with a scar. So the medical profession came up with a bikini cut. We didn't use that. They didn't use that word. We used that word, right? We wanted our husbands with us. We wanted to be awake during a cesarean. We didn't want our twins to be at risk. We didn't want our breech babies to be at risk. We didn't want our Rh negative babies to be at risk. We didn't want to have those risks. We didn't want to have our diabetic babies be at risk or our premature babies be at risk. We demanded change, and the systems have given us that change in modern cultures. And that's why women in traditional cultures want these things. They want them just like they'd like electricity, running water, indoor plumbing, and refrigeration. I know because I've lived through it, and I've worked for many, many years in cultures where there is no access to medical care. So when the natural birth movement started off blaming the medical profession, I just didn't understand that at all back then, and neither did the families that I worked with, because many of them were medically high risk. Some would never see a doctor due to faith-based reasons, and others just used every medical thing that they could because they desperately wanted to reduce or prevent their risks from becoming a tragedy. They could accept they could become a problem. They didn't want a tragedy. And the other message that the natural birth movement came up with quite early was an assumption was made that just because we fall pregnant that we know how to birth. And it's connected to that belief that we naturally know how to birth for the goal that all women want. Okay, so the natural birth movement, we all knew we wanted a safe and healthy pregnancy and birth, and we pretty much wanted a positive birth, although we accepted whatever birth. But the natural birth movement basically made the assumption that because women fall pregnant, that we know how to achieve both a healthy and safe birth for ourselves and baby, and that we know how to achieve a positive birth experience. That was always an illusion. That was not happening. Wasn't happening then and certainly isn't happening now. So what was the natural birth movement goal? Well, basically, the goal was for women to have a spontaneous labor and delivery without any medical care, preferably at home, preferably in water, and preferably with a midwife. That was a strong natural birth movement message, that somehow was the true birth, the real birth, and everything else fell short. That's women talking to each other. This is what's been very stressful for me as just an individual, trying to go forward with the message that families developed and asked me to carry forward, which is 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. It's an activity each of us does with our baby, and it should be normal and natural to learn skills to do that activity no matter where we birth or what happens to us around us or who's present or our choices or lack of or change of or circumstances or our beliefs. We can't say it enough, right? Women do not instinctively know how to birth. It's a physiological experience. It doesn't mean you know how to do it. It happens to you. We don't know how to be a good lover just because we're horny. We don't know how to cook a good meal just because we're hungry. We don't even know what foods are safe to put in our mouth if we go outside of our cultural norm. So the natural birth movement implied that all women instinctively knew how to do this infrequent experience just because we're pregnant. And that doesn't make any sense because it would carry over into that we instinctively knew how to breastfeed. We instinctively knew how to parent. We don't, right? So we have to stop doing this to each other as women. So since the 1980s, since the natural birth movement has been such a predominant conversation, have we achieved those goals? Have we achieved the goals that women instinctively know how to birth? Well, some of you listening to this go, well, I did. And that's wonderful. That goes back to the individuality. You care about your birth, and I care about my birth. Do I care that you had that wonderful experience? Of course. Do you care that I had a terrible experience, or a wonderful experience, or a so-so experience, or that I loved it, or that I hated it, or that my baby died, or that I had pain on sex from tearing naturally? I mean, do you care? No, you care about your birth. I care about my birth. I'm pleased for you but I don't evaluate you as a human being based on your birth experience. Do you evaluate me? So we want to ask, have more women, are more women having the birth they want, that they're spending time creating a birth plan for? And the answer is no, flatly no. I have talked to tens of thousands of women, tens of thousands in 50 years. I can honestly tell you that 99.9999999% of women, their birth is nothing like they planned or imagined, right? What do you think? You never know what your birth is going to be like until it unfolds. So the idea that you could plan a birth and you could make a birth plan, it doesn't achieve the goals of getting the birth you want. And if the birth we want across the board is a safe birth and a healthy birth, then all of us who live in modern cultures are pretty much going to say yes to medical assessments, monitoring, and procedures if we feel that ourselves or our babies are at risk. And so, are there more spontaneous labors and deliveries occurring at home without medical care and water and with a midwife? Well, the population's growing, so yeah, there are to some extent. But even in New Zealand, since 1990s, where women's choices are elevated on a pedestal, the home birth rate at some point was maybe 10%, in which there was, I couldn't find statistics of how many of those transferred into the hospital. But now it's maybe 5%. So the goal of the natural birth movement to see more women birthing at home, even in countries where home birth was the norm, the rate of home births has gone down. Is that good or bad? We don't evaluate that. We do think, as a trust, that had Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley Dick Reed in the early 50s and 60s said 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. It's an activity each of us is going to do. All of us should become skilled to do it. We honestly believe that generation after generation of everybody becoming skilled, skills like birthing better, that did evolve, became more sophisticated and more realistic, would lead to safer births, healthier mothers and babies, more positive birth experiences, and probably more home births. Because when women birth efficiently and effectively, whether they're high risk or low risk, and babies come out of their body and women's bodies aren't damaged, then more people feel confident to birth where they can have access to medical care, but don't necessarily need it at the moment. And the medical profession would be more relaxed. Because when I gave birth in 1970, multiple millions of mothers and fathers were using skills to some degree. And that relaxed the medical profession, the labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians. However, because the goal was to have low-risk women achieving a natural birth without medical care and pain-free labor, in the mindset of everybody back then, that was the goal. And that labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians weren't seeing that, and we weren't experiencing that. However, if the goal had been back then that 100% of pregnant women are going to do this activity, everybody should have skills, because the first thing we want to do is to reduce the suffering that women have experienced throughout time. Labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians throughout the United States from the 60s to the mid-70s saw that in diamonds. Multiple millions of women, my generation, look back on their birth with a more positive experience, because even though we didn't like everything that was done, we used skills to cope, to manage, to work through, to deal with, to handle, to stay on top of and feel in control. And our husbands coached us. They actively used skills to help us do that. And we appreciated that. So we've gone off the track from the beginning. And this is what our trust is trying to remedy now. We're trying to give you a new idea. 100% of pregnant women will give birth. It's an activity each of us does. It's normal and natural to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills. Should be normal and natural for every birth professional, obstetrician, midwife, childbirth educator, doula, to tell all of their clients this simple message. You are going to do the activity of birthing your baby. Learn some skills, then use those skills. And they should also be telling them, if I'm present at your birth and you look like you're coping and managing, I'm going to be delighted because it makes my job more fun. I like working with skilled families, and you will have a better birth experience. You're probably reducing or preventing some of the risks from perhaps from becoming problems. And this is just a good thing. If you look like you're not coping and I'm your birth professional and we've marked in your notes each simple skill that you've learned, I or someone else can look at the notes and encourage you to use them. You may have forgotten for a moment. Your birth may have changed into something else and you feel, I shouldn't bother to use skills. And we can remind you, this is your baby's birth. Use skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. So the question is what happens to women who don't achieve those three goals? What if you're high risk and you feel you lack choices, or you're trying to make choices around the risks and negotiate? Don't you think that if you had skills that you might be able to negotiate better? We could, because we behaved better, right? We looked like we were coping rather than, the medical profession doesn't want us to suffer. So they want to save us by using medical pain relief or using assessments, monitoring procedures. So if you did not achieve a natural birth that you wanted, what happened to you? How do you feel about that? And that's been this exponential rise in shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and perceived emotional birth trauma around birth, because not enough women have achieved those goals. And did you have that ideal birth? Or did you end up having the birth you had? And did you feel empowered by your birth? Or do you feel that shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, frustration, anger, and even emotional trauma from your birth experience? So any ideas, words, and actions that don't achieve the goal, the ideas are wrong, but if the ideas are right and the words and actions aren't right, tweak them. That's a principle. It's called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So goals should pretty much align with the ideas, the words, the actions. In other words, if the natural birth movement wants more women to have a spontaneous labor and delivery, whether at home or in the hospital, let's broaden it out into the hospital, right? Then they're basically saying that we're defining natural birth as a certain thing. And this is where it becomes more complicated, because I'm going to put up a list of things that the natural birth movement said we needed to avoid in order to achieve a natural birth. And this is where when you look at your birth, did you perceive of your birth as being natural? Did you perceive of it being natural just because you didn't have a cesarean, but you ended up having a forceps and episiotomy and induction, ruptured membrane? Is that how you perceive of natural birth? There was a midwife in New Zealand who did a study of midwifery notes for several years, and that was the definition of natural birth at first, and then into the 2005 or 6, was that every birth that wasn't a cesarean was considered a natural birth. But that's not what the natural birth movement considers it to be. And this post was a question asked at workshops that I taught to New Zealand midwives. And I could have asked it to midwives around the world. What do you consider to be a natural birth? And they would say ones without medical intervention, because basically the assessments, monitoring, and procedures were lumped under the word interventions and have been told to women for years they are unnecessary and imposed on you, and you just need to make a birth plan and say no to them or do your research. And this is the foundation of why the natural birth movement is so anti-medical and so confusing to people. We are basically, even within the midwifery profession, and New Zealand midwives were the same. New Zealand midwives decided that they weren't going to be nurse midwives because the home birth midwifery group believed that nurse midwives were medwives. So even within the midwifery profession, there is this distinction between real midwives and medwives. And this is women to each other. And so women to each other. I mean, I talked to the mother, she's my age, of the man who used to be the Minister of Health in New Zealand. And she just spontaneously said to me, I wanted to have a natural birth, but I was induced. And you're thinking, this is what we're doing to each other. You know, is a natural birth a cesarean? Well, we know it's a surgical birth, but birth comes naturally after pregnancy. It's an activity that we have to do. So we can use skills on the way to the hospital. We can use skills being prepped. We can use skills during surgery. We don't naturally use skills, but if there's an idea that tells us we should naturally and normally learn skills in pregnancy and use it to work through the activity of birthing our baby, then more of us will. So you need to understand that the natural birth movement, women put this constriction on each other. And when I asked the midwives in New Zealand what was stopping more women from having this natural birth, it was this list of at least 30, and there were more, but I shortened it down, right? It's just crazy. But then I asked another question, which profoundly, to me, really helped me understand why I have spent 50 years of my life carrying forward this concept that 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. It's an activity we have to do. All of us should become skilled to do this activity, no matter where we birth, no matter who is present at our birth, no matter our personal circumstances or our beliefs, our choices, our lack of choices, our change of choices, or what happens to or around us. Because skilled women birth better, no matter what. And it's our baby's birth. So if the natural birth movement is honest with itself, it has made it too hard for women to achieve a natural birth because we have to say no to so much medical assessment, monitoring procedures, which we may not want, which we may not like, which we may feel are unnecessary and we may feel are imposed on us. And it's true, if you don't want to birth around medical care, don't do it. Don't go to a doctor ever. Don't go to a midwife ever, because they're all going to do medical assessments and monitoring, because that is their responsibility to their profession. And if they didn't do it and something happened, you can fault them. But what struck me was asking midwives in New Zealand as women to women, what is their concept of an ideal birth? And there it is. So when we are talking about an ideal birth, you need to understand that this is what women are saying to each other. And this is why the natural birth movement we really cannot have a natural birth movement driving the conversation childbirth. We have to at least couple skills to choices and put more emphasis on skills, because an activity is not what you choose, it is what you do. So when we look at the ideal birth and we go through it, then what we're saying is we want women to be left alone. We wanted our husbands to be in birth with us. We didn't want to be left alone anymore. We wanted somebody to help us. What is instinctive? I'm going to talk about some of these in future parts of this series. No interventions, none of these 30 things. They want it to be spontaneous, as though spontaneous means that it's good and it's safe and it's a good outcome. But spontaneous can mean a dead baby or a dead mother or a tear or a woman suffering. A woman in control. What does she mean by in control? And I can tell you that being in control, how it's phrased here, and what women meant was that women knew the kind of birth they wanted and they got the kind of birth they wanted. That's the control. or they could say no or yes to medical care, which is a good part of control. But if women, I can't tell you how many women have demanded not to have medical care when their behavior is out of control because they are ideologically motivated. So being in control means you have to look like you're coping well, right? No pharmaceuticals. Honestly, Rogam wasn't developed until, what about women who have strep B? What about women with diabetes? What is this? This is an ideal birth where women do not take medications. A woman is active. What's active mean? You're doing the activity. You're active enough, even if you're sitting still. Biologically led. Follow body's cues. What does that mean? I can tell you that in New Zealand, they decided that they wanted to use change of positions as a pain relief tactic, which meant that if a woman was having a progressive labor where the contractions got stronger, longer, and more intense, she was encouraged to change positions so that the labor backed off and she had some space in between. This is crazy stuff. If she lacks skills, she's not coping with the progressive labor. Why do you want to slow the labor down so that she doesn't feel as much pain? You want the labor to go on. Get on with it. Because if it slows down and it doesn't pick up again, she's more likely to end up with more medical care. And what are body cues? Not all women respond to body cues, particularly pain, in a proactive way. When we have pain, we react to pain. We don't respond to pain. Most of us, when we have pain, any pain, men or women, any pain, we tense up. We go into a fright, flight, fight, or freeze mode. It is counterintuitive to soften and relax when you're feeling pain. And women who have these sometimes very beautiful births that you see, if you say to them afterwards, "What were you doing?" And they will tell you, "I was focused on relaxing. I was focused on my breathing." They were using skills to be counterintuitive to the response to pain. A spontaneous onset of labor, no drugs, no rupture of membrane, a spontaneous pushing. Some women don't have a spontaneous urge to push, and some women have a spontaneous urge to push before their cervix is dilated. Women listening to their bodies instead of outside voices. Most women do not listen to their bodies. In fact, when these skills started to develop, we would say to a man, "You've got a grapefruit-sized object coming through your penis. What do you think you'd do? Prepare it?" And the men would go, "Absolutely." And what would the women do? Where's my cervix? Right? So we don't always know. How many of us actually check ourselves in labor? Very few. How many of us have really prepared our vagina to let a grapefruit out? Not too many. Perineal massage isn't really doing that. That's taking a tiny little area and hoping to stretch it enough. That's not where babies really get stuck. Okay? So all of these ideal births, physiological third stage, gosh darn, that means you let a woman bleed, doesn't it? Because it's physiological if she bleeds too much. And to follow a woman's birth plan, oh my God. Honestly, when birth plans started to come out in the early 1980s, they were like books. I want some music. I want dim lights. I want to have food. I want this. I don't want this. I don't want this. I don't want this. I want this. I don't want this. I want these tiny little, picky little things, almost like a wedding. You know, this has to be placed here and it has to look like this. Babies don't come to plan. There's no way to know what your birth is going to be like. And the reality is that nobody can give you the birth you want. The best we can do is to have the best birth we can, and that comes from our being skilled. Birth is a one-off. How many times are you going to have a baby? It is infrequent. It cannot be replayed. It is life transforming. We remember our birth. We are impacted by it. Do you not think that we as women need to get clearer about what all of us as pregnant women do? I think we need to get clearer. I've spent 50 years trying to get people clearer. And what has been the response to that? I have been shouted down by the natural birth movement and home birth midwives resoundingly. They cannot ideologically perceive of 100% of pregnant women becoming skilled and using skills to work through their baby's birth because of these two lists on the screen now. That is what the natural birth movement represents: an ideal birth and none of the other list. As women, we are doing damage to ourselves and each other and our children. And we've been doing this since the 70s, since the 80s. Those three obstetricians started it. We can't go back and blame them. We can understand it. We didn't have to follow it. We had choices back then. We could see that skills helped women cope better. We could see that fathers coaching us helped us cope better. We could see that. We experienced that. We had a choice back then to grow a skilled birthing population for all births. We had a choice back in the 60s and the 70s to do that. The beginning part of the natural birth movement made a choice not to do that. They dismissed skills. Cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women don't need to be taught to birth. And they developed ideas that are listed in this talk, that birth is natural only when it does not have this medical care, medical assessments, monitoring procedures, and it is only truly a real birth if you achieve that ideal birth. And as women to each other, we have to stop doing that. We have to stop doing it. And how do we stop doing it? As women and men, we understand another idea. 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. Each of us is going to do this activity with our baby, no matter where we birth, who is present, our beliefs, our circumstances, our choices, our lack of choices, the change of choices, or what happens to or around us. Every single one of us can be empowered and dignified by having self-learned skills in pregnancy and then using them. That's just the way it is. This can happen. We as women need to spread this message to each other. If you are a birth worker, then your job is to spread the message faster. And you do that by giving a simple script. You tell all of your clients the same thing. 100% of you are going to do the activity of giving birth. It's normal and natural for you to learn some skills to do that activity. Because we are writing down choices in your birth notes, we're going to write down the skills. I don't need to learn them as a professional. You need to learn them. And we'll mark down at 24 weeks, 28 weeks, 32 weeks, 36 weeks, 38 weeks, 40 weeks, 42 weeks, what skills you're learning. And if I'm at your birth and you look like you're coping and managing, I'm going to praise the two of you, or the three of you, or the 10 of you, or yourself, whatever. And if you look overwhelmed, I can refer to the notes, and so can anyone else, and we can encourage you to use the skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. And our ultimate goal is that women, yes, have a safe birth, have a healthy baby and a mother, and have a positive experience because they can give birth with all of this medical care. They can give birth in a totally non-ideal circumstances and use skills to work through the activity of giving our baby. And how do we know this is successful? Because we've had 50 years of doing this, right? So it's up to you now. I can just do so much, doing my best. But please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please go to our Birthing Better Facebook page. Please tell other people, and please start to spread the word. We don't care if people use their Birthing Better skills. There are lots of birth skills. You just need to learn some, and you need to learn ones that are going to be adaptable, adjustable, and sustainable no matter the type of birth you have. And that is where Birthing Better excels, because it's always been about everybody, not about natural birth. And that small group of women who want it, and that smaller group of women who achieve it. We do not want that shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and birth trauma to continue to exist through the next generation. You can change it. I'm trying. You've got to help me out here, and you've got to help our trust, Common Knowledge Trust, to spread the word. Thank you for listening, and I'm onward to the next series, next day and the next day and the next day, because there's a long list of things that I'm going to talk about in you and childbirth. Bye-bye.